Everybody in Kettle Springs had a story about Roan Teague, and no two of them agreed. Some said he'd killed his own family up on that mountain and buried them where the aspens go silver. Some said he kept a tin box of scalps under his bed and counted them on Sundays like a man counting money. The saloon boys said he traded a rifle to Geronimo himself, back before the surrender, and that he'd laughed while he did it. Mothers used him to make children eat. Finish your supper or the Teague man will come down. I believed all of it, every ugly word. I'd never met the man, and I believed all of it, because in that country belief was cheaper than water and you didn't have to haul it up from anywhere. Then one night in September of '89, I rode up that mountain in the dark with my 9-year-old son bleeding through my coat, and I put a rifle on the monster's chest before he'd even gotten his door all the way open. He looked at the barrel, he looked at the boy. And the first thing that came out of his mouth, the very first thing, before "who are you," before "what happened," before "get that gun off me," was a question so small and so plain that it took me 11 years to stop hearing it. I'm going to tell you what he asked. But not yet, because you won't understand what it cost him, or what it cost me, or what it cost the boy sleeping in his loft that night, until you've climbed the same road I climbed, sick with fear, certain I was carrying my child to a butcher. My name is Ada Wilcox. I keep a ledger of everything I owe. This is the debt I've never been able to write a number beside. The blood had gone from hot to cold against my ribs, and that scared me worse than when it was hot. Micah was slung across the saddle in front of me, chest down, my left arm hooked under him like a bar of iron. He hadn't made a sound in 9 or 10 minutes. Before that he'd been talking not sense exactly, but talking, saying "Ma, the dog's got out, Ma, the dog, and we haven't had a dog since his father died." I'd have given both my hands to hear him say something foolish about a dog again. The mare was blown. She was climbing switchbacks she couldn't see, and I was asking her to do it at a pace that would kill her, and she was doing it anyway, and I kept thinking, even the horse is better than the people down there. Because down there, down at the bottom of the road, in the flat dark where Kettle Springs sat with its lamps lit, down there were 11 men with rifles, and one of them had shot my son. Not on purpose. That's the thing I've never been able to swallow whole, not on purpose. I want to tell this in order, but it doesn't come in order. It comes the way it came, the crack of the shot, flat and stupid, and then the silence right after, which is the worst sound a person can hear. Then Micah folding up in the doorway of the smokehouse like his strings were cut. Then me running with my skirt in both fists, and Cal Pike standing there with the rifle still up at his shoulder, 17 years old, mouth open, saying he had a blanket on him. Mrs. Wilcox. Mrs. Wilcox, he had a blanket on him. He did. My son had a blanket on him. It was cold, and he'd taken the Navajo blanket off the porch chair because it was closest, and he was going out to check whether the mare had kicked her water bucket over again. 9 years old, wrapped in wool the color of rust. And the men of Kettle Springs had been hunting an Apache boy for 2 days. Let me back up, because you have to understand what the town was in those weeks, and I don't want to make them into devils. I've done that. It's a comfort. It's also a lie. Geronimo had surrendered 3 years before. They'd loaded the Chiricahua onto trains, the fighters, the old ones, the women, the children, the scouts who'd served the army faithfully, all of them, all together, no sorting, and sent them to Florida, to Alabama, to places with a wetness in the air that killed them slow. Everybody knew that. Nobody in Kettle Springs said it out loud, and everybody knew it. So when a boy turned up, when a rancher out past the dragoons found a horse gone and a smokehouse door standing open and a set of small moccasin prints in the wash, when somebody said Chiricahua the way you'd say fire in a dry season, then 11 men got rifles, and the storekeeper hung a paper in his window with a number on it, and the number was $20, and a man named Holly's Pike put a deputy's star on his coat and told everybody to stay calm in a voice built entirely for the opposite. $20, I want you to sit with that. $20 for a child. I didn't say anything about it. Not one word. I owed the mercantile $4.60, and I owed Doc Ambrose $14 for the winter he spent failing to keep my husband breathing, and I have a note in my ledger for both, in pencil, and I have never once in my life been able to afford an opinion. So I stayed quiet, and I let them ride past my gate with lanterns, and 2 nights later one of them shot my son on my own porch. That is what quiet buys you. They carried Micah inside. Doc Ambrose was with the posse, of course he was. They'd taken him along for the excitement, and he'd taken a bottle along for the doctoring, and he came in and put his hands on my boy, and I smelled him before I saw him. Through the side, he said, under the ribs. He was trying to be steady, and his fingers were doing the little dance that fingers do. Ada, Ada, listen, there's an exit, that's something. Then do it. Do what? Whatever you do. He looked at me, and I watched a man decide something and hate himself for deciding it. I can't see, he said. Ada, I can't, I'm not. He held up his own hand, and we both watched it shake, and it was, God help us both, the most honest thing anyone did that night. Holly's pike was in my doorway. The star on his coat caught lamplight. Behind him his boy stood with his hat off, weeping like water out of a broke pipe, and nobody in that room went to him, including me. There's a man on the mountain, Pike said. I remember I laughed. It came out wrong, a bark, Teague. He was Army once. Hospital steward, some say. He's done work on men before, Wheeler when his arm went bad, and that Mexican down at the mine. He's a butcher, Hollies, you've said it yourself. You've stood in that street and said it. And Pike looked at me with a face I'd never seen on him, a face that had been kicked hollow from the inside, and he said, I have said a lot of things. That is the whole of it. That is the entire moral education of Kettle Springs, Arizona Territory, delivered in 6 words by a coward on my porch at 9:30 at night. I didn't let any of them come with me. I didn't want their lanterns on that road. I told myself it was for the horse. The road up Teague's mountain isn't a road. It's a suggestion somebody made once with a shovel. I climbed it in the dark with my son's blood soaking through wool into my chemise, and I recited the rumors to myself, one after another, like beads. He killed his wife. He killed a Chiricahua woman and her child, and he liked it. He burned the Kessler wagon with the family still in it. He keeps their hair. I'd never once asked who'd seen any of it. Not once, in 11 years of living at the foot of that mountain. It never occurred to me that a thing everybody said might not have anybody underneath it. I'd have laughed at you for suggesting there was a difference. Here is what I want to say about that, and then I'll leave it. Fear is restful. That's the secret nobody admits. It costs nothing. A man you're afraid of is a man you never have to think about again. You've filed him. You've closed the ledger on him. I climbed that mountain to hand my child to a man I had filed. Micah stopped breathing right once near the top. Just stopped. A hitch and then nothing, and I said his name into the back of his neck, and it started again, wet and ragged, and I don't know what I said after that. I don't think it was words. The cabin came out of the dark all at once, the way things do at altitude, no glow, no warning, just a black shape squared against a blacker slope, and then a line of light under a door. A dog started up, not the big baying you'd expect. A short, businesslike bark twice and then quiet, and that quiet was somehow worse. I got down. I don't know how. My legs had turned to sacks of meal. I pulled Micah off the saddle, and he came into my arms limp as a sleeping calf and heavier than the world, and I had my dead husband's Winchester under my right arm and my son under my left, and I could not have used either one properly. I kicked the door 3 times with the toe of my boot, and I was screaming something. The light went out inside. That's what he did first. He killed the lamp. Smart. I've thought about that since. A man who's had people come up his hill before. Then the door opened about a hand's width. And there was nothing in it. and then it opened the rest of the way. Roan Teague was not big. That was my first outrage. The whole valley had made him 7 feet tall, and he stood there in a nightshirt and trousers, barefoot, maybe 5'10", with iron-gray hair chopped off at the jaw like he'd done it himself with a knife, which he had. 45, 50. Sunk eyes. A face that had been out in weather so long it had given up and become weather. 2 fingers on his left hand were wrong. Set crooked, healed crooked, years crooked. He had no gun. That's the second thing I've thought about for 11 years. He opened his door at midnight to a screaming woman, and he had no gun in his hand. I got the Winchester up. I don't know how. I must have let Micah's legs down, must have braced him against my hip. I don't remember, but I got that barrel up, and it was maybe 2 feet from the middle of his chest, and my whole body was going like a struck bell. I want to tell you what I expected him to say. I expected who's there. I expected get off my mountain. I expected the barrel to be knocked aside and a hand at my throat. Somewhere far back in me, in the part that had been fed $20 worth of stories, I expected him to smile. Roan Teague looked at the rifle for about half a second. It didn't seem to interest him. His eyes went past it down to the bundle sagging against my hip, to the black wetness spreading over my forearm. And he said, "What's his name?" I have turned that over 10,000 times. I've held it up to the light. I've tried to make it into something ordinary, and I can't. Not what happened, not how bad, not who shot him or who sent you or are you alone, not one syllable about himself, and there was a rifle on his heart. What's his name? Something came apart in me. I heard my own voice say, Micah, and it broke in the middle of 2 syllables, and the rifle went down because my arms wouldn't hold it, and Roan Teague stepped forward and took the weight of my son off me so gently that I didn't feel the moment it left. Micah, he said to the boy, not to me, to the boy. All right, Micah, we're going to make a lot of noise now, and none of it's your fault. Then over his shoulder, walking, shut the door, there's a bar, use it. I stood in his doorway with my husband's rifle hanging off my hand like a dead bird, and I barred the door of a monster's house from the inside. He'd lit the lamp again and a second one, and he had the trestle table cleared with one arm before I'd crossed the room. Cans, a tin plate, a coffee mill, all of it swept to the floor, ringing. He laid Micah down on the bare boards. He got a knife and he opened my son's shirt from collar to hem in one motion, and I made a sound, and he said, without looking up, "That was a good shirt. I'm sorry about the shirt." And I laughed. God forgive me. I stood in that cabin and laughed like a lunatic with tears running into my collar. "Boil that," he said, and pointed with his chin at a kettle. "Stove's hot. It stays hot. Put the small pot on and put the flat tin in it, the one with the, you'll see it. Everything in the tin goes in the water and stays in the water. Don't touch what's in the tin with your fingers." Why? Because I asked. I did it. My hands were somebody else's hands. I want to tell you about the room, because I saw it in pieces that night and I've assembled it since, and the assembling is most of what I have. It was clean, that's what I couldn't get over. Not tidy, clean, scrubbed. Lye and juniper smoke, a rope of dried peppers, a shelf of tins with paper labels in a small square hand, a tin cup with a chipped rim, 1 cup, 1 plate, 1 everything, which is a particular kind of arithmetic that tells you a man does not expect company and has stopped hopping for it. Books, 4 of them. One was Army, Manual of Military Surgery, cover gone. One was a Bible with more things folded into it than printed in it. A yellow dog with a chewed ear lay by the stove and watched me and did not get up. And on the wall, where a man might hang a saddle or a saint, there was a shelf, and on the shelf there was a wooden box about the size of a bread loaf. I looked at that box and I thought, hair. I'm ashamed to write it. I stood in that man's house, boiling his instruments, and I looked at his one beautiful thing and thought that's where he keeps the scalps. The work took a long time, and it isn't the part I want to dwell on, though he made me look. That was deliberate. Hold there, he said. 2 fingers, press like you mean it. Harder, you won't hurt him worse than he's hurt. I can't. Ada, he'd gotten my name somewhere, I never gave it to him. You've been strong the whole way up this hill. Don't lay it down inside where it's warm. He worked with that ruined left hand as steady as a church. He talked the entire time low, in a rhythm not to me, to Micah. Now this'll pull. Now this is the ugly part and it'll be over. You're doing fine, you're doing fine. I've seen grown men make more fuss over a splinter. A boy 9 years old, gray as ash, drifting somewhere below the floor of himself, and this man kept his name in his mouth like it was a rope he was holding the other end of. The ball had gone through. Ambrose was right about that much. It had gone under the ribs and out the back, and it had missed the things that make a man die in 10 minutes, and it had not missed everything. At some point Roan sat back on his heels and shut his eyes, and I said, "Is he?" And he said, "Quiet." And I've never been so obedient in my life. He was listening, not to me, to Micah's breathing. "He'll rot or he won't," he said finally. "That's the whole of it, next 3 days. Anybody tells you different is selling you something." "That's not," my voice came out of a stranger, "that's not enough." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." And he got up and washed his hands and washed them again and put the kettle back on, and only when he turned to the stove did I see that his shoulders had started shaking and that he'd waited to turn around before he let them. Near 2 in the morning, I found I was sitting on the floor with my back against the table leg, and Micah's hand in mine, and I hadn't decided to be there. Roan set a cup of something by my knee, willow and something bitter under it. "Who shot him?" he asked, not gently, just first now when it was time for it. "Cal Pike. Holly's his boy." He nodded once like a man checking a sum. "They hunting." I didn't answer. I looked at the fire. "Ada, quiet. Are they hunting?" "There's a boy," I said. "They say Apache. Come off the reservation or come down from somewhere nobody knows. Took a horse and some meat out of Farrell's smokehouse." I heard how it sounded. I said it anyway. "They've got a paper up. $20. The lamp hissed. The dog's tail moved once against the boards and stopped. Roan Teague stood very still with his back to me, and then he said something I didn't understand at all, and I've thought about it since more than almost anything else. He said 20, that's more than last time. I heard it after that. I don't know if it had been there all along. A sound from the loft. Not much. The particular creak wood makes when something living on it has been holding still too long and finally has to move. I was on my feet with the Winchester before I knew I'd reached for it. Fear is fast. Fear is the fastest thing in a human being, faster than love, and anybody who tells you otherwise has never had a child. Ada, Roan hadn't moved. I had the rifle at the ladder. My hands were steady now. Isn't that something? All night they'd shaken and now they were steady. "Ada, look at me." "Who's up there?" "Look at me." I looked. He was between me and the ladder without ever seeming to have crossed the room, and his hands were open at his sides, palms out, the crooked fingers splayed. "There is a child up there," he said, "who has been awake this whole time listening to you save yours." The world tipped. "He has a hole in his foot from a wire snare that Farrell set for coyotes. It's 4 days old and it's green at the edges, and he has not once cried where I could hear it. He came up my hill on that foot. Do you understand what I'm telling you? He came up my hill, on that foot." He's 12, Roan said. "He is 12 years old and he is worth $20 in your town." I stood there with a gun pointed up into the dark of a loft where a 12-year-old was lying, and I could not make my arms come down, and I want to be truthful about this above everything else in this whole account. I thought about the doctor. That's what went through me, not a noble thought, not one thought about that child. What went through Ada Wilcox in that cabin at 2 in the morning was, if I ride down and tell them where he is, they'll come up. Ambrose will come up. Sober maybe by dawn, they'll bring a wagon. They'll bring anything I want. $20 and a doctor, and the whole town's arms around me. And all it costs is a boy I've never met. I have never told anybody that part, not my sister, not the man I married after, I'm telling you. Roan watched my face. I think he watched the entire shape of it go across me, the way you'd watch weather come over a ridge, and he didn't say a word while it happened. He let me have it. That's what he did. He let me stand there and be exactly as small as I was. Then he reached up, slow, both hands where I could see them, and took the barrel of the Winchester and moved it maybe 6 inches to the left, so it pointed at the wall. "There's a name for what you're feeling," he said. "It's not the one you're afraid of. Don't," my teeth were going, "don't you say a word to me. You don't know what's in me." "No," he said, "but I know what's in me." And he went to the shelf, and he took down the box. I couldn't breathe. He set it on the table beside my son's hand, and he opened the lid and turned it toward me. And I looked into a monster's box, and I saw a child's shoe, one brown cracked laces gone. A wooden comb with 3 teeth broken out. A tin ring, the kind you win at a fair. A folded scrap of blue calico. And a bundle of paper, maybe 40 sheets, thin as onion skin, tied with a bootlace, and every sheet covered top to bottom in that small square hand. Names. Column after column of names, some in English, some in a script I didn't know and have never learned, some with dates, some with only a place, Skeleton Canyon below the Dragoons, the wash at Sibique, Og, some with nothing but a word beside them, boy, woman, old, some scratched out and rewritten as though he'd learned it wrong the first time and gone back years later to fix it. Hundreds, there were hundreds. They wrote them down as numbers, Roan Teague said. His voice had gone somewhere flat and terrible. In the reports, I read the reports. I was a hospital steward, Ada. I wrote some of them myself before I understood what I was writing. One female, one juvenile, you understand. That's a whole person. That's a whole person, and that's her whole line. He put one crooked finger on the paper without touching it. So I ask, whoever's in front of me, whatever's left of them, however long I've got, I ask first before anything, because after is too late, and I have been too late more times than there are sheets in that box. He looked up. Sometimes they can answer. Mostly they can't. I write what I can find out. It's not much. It's not nothing. The stove ticked. "Your husband's in there," he said. I heard myself say, "What?" "Tom Wilcox, 87, February. Ambrose sent for me at the end because he'd run out of things to try and he wanted somebody in the room who wasn't him." Roan wasn't looking at me now. "You were asleep in the chair. He asked me to tell you the horse wasn't your fault. I never came down to tell you because by then the valley had made me what it made me, and I judged a stranger at your door would frighten you worse than the not knowing." He closed the box. "That was cowardice," he said, "and I've carried it, and now you've got it, and I'm sorry." I don't know how long I stood there, long enough for the lamp to want oil. Above us in the dark of the loft something shifted again, small, a held breath let go. I said to the ladder, in a voice I did not recognize as mine, "What's your name?" "Nothing." Roan said something then in a language that moved like water over stones, 3 or 4 words, and waited, and there was a silence, and then a boy's voice answered him, thin, wrung out, and absolutely level. 6 syllables, maybe 7. Roan almost smiled. It was an awful thing to see on that face. It was like watching a stone try. "What did he say?" "He said he'll give his name when he decides to," Roan said. "He said a name is given. He says you've all been taking things off him for 4 days and you're not taking that." I put my hand over my mouth. "Ada," Roan said, "he's right, and you'll wait and you'll earn it same as I did." And then the dog stood up. Not a bark. That's what I remember. The yellow dog with the chewed ear rose off the floor and faced the door and made no sound at all, and the hair went up along its spine in a ridge from shoulder to tail. Roan crossed to the window and put one finger on the shutter, and eased it a quarter inch. I came up beside him. Down below, strung out along the switchbacks like beads on a wet string, coming up my mountain, coming up his mountain, were lanterns. I counted 6, then 8. Then I stopped counting because somewhere in the black between them, a man's voice came up thin and clear on the cold air, and it was Holly's Pike, and he was calling my name. Roan Teague let the shutter fall closed. He looked at my son on his table. He looked at the ladder to the loft. Then he picked my husband's Winchester up off the floor where I'd let it lie, and he checked it, and he held it out to me stock first with those 2 crooked fingers curled under the barrel. "Well," he said, "you came up here to point a gun at a monster." He nodded at the door. "Go on out there and pick which one." The cold on that porch was a physical thing, like walking into standing water. I came out with my husband's rifle and shut the door behind me with my heel, and stood at the top of 3 plank steps with my son's blood dried black to my elbow. And below me, on the flat where a man might keep a woodpile, there were 11 lanterns and 11 men, and their breath went up together in the light like something coming out of the ground. Holly's Pike was in front, the star, the hat in his hand which I noticed and which made me want to be sick. "Ada," he said it the way you'd say it across a fence on a Sunday. "Ada, you shouldn't have come up here alone." I didn't answer. I was doing arithmetic. 11 men. 6 rifles I could see, 2 shotguns, and Farrell had a coach gun broke open over his forearm like he was out after quail. Behind them, hunched on a mule with his bag on the pommel, Doc Ambrose, and even at that distance and in that light I could see he'd been sick down his own coat somewhere on the climb. And at the very back, holding the horses, not looking at me, Cal Pike, 17 years old. "Is the boy alive?" Holly said. Something in me wanted to laugh again, and I put it down like a dog. "Which one?" I said. The word went through them. I watched it. A dozen little shifts, boots in gravel, a hand moving on a stock. Farrell's head came up like a hound's. "So he's here," Farrell said. "That's not what she said." Holly's didn't turn around. "Ada, that's not what you said." "Isn't it?" "Ada." He came a step closer and the lantern swung and I saw his face plain for the first time. And there is a particular ruin that comes over a man in the middle of his life when he finds out what he is, and Holly's Pike was wearing it. "Ada, I've got Ambrose. I brought him up. He slept 2 hours and had coffee and he's better. Let him in. Let him look at Micah." And God help me, I wanted it. I wanted it so badly I felt my knees think about it. "He's better," I repeated. "He's better than he was." He was drunk on my porch while my son bled through the floorboards. My voice was doing something strange. It had gone very quiet and very even, and it carried across that whole clearing like a bell in fog. He held his own hand up and showed it to me shaking. "And you stood in my door, Holly's, with that star on, and you said there's a man on the mountain. You said it. You sent me here." "I did." "You sent me to the butcher." "Ada." "Say it." I felt the stock come up against my shoulder, not aimed, just up, and every rifle in that clearing moved an inch and I did not care. "You've called that man a butcher in the street for 11 years. You've told it to children. Say it now in his yard with your hat in your hand. Say Roan Teague's a butcher." Silence, wind in the pines above the cabin, that long tearing sound. Holly's Pike looked at his boots. "He's not," he said. Louder. "He is not a butcher." It came out of him ragged. "He set Wheeler's arm and he wouldn't take money. He sat with Tom Wilcox for 2 nights when there wasn't a soul in that town would go in the room." He lifted his head. "And I never said different, not once, not out loud. And that's the same as saying it, and I know it, and I'm standing here with a star on my coat at 3 in the morning knowing it." Nobody moved. Then Farrell spat and said, "Are we having church or are we getting him?" I want to be careful about Farrell, because he is the easiest man in this account to make into a monster, and I have promised myself I wouldn't do that anymore. Farrell was 51. He had a bad shoulder and a bad wife and 400 acres of the worst grass in the territory, and he had lost 11 calves that spring to coyotes, and he had set snares along his water. That is all true. He set the snares because he was afraid of the winter. It is a very ordinary thing to be a man made cruel by the cold arithmetic of the ledger, and I of all people had no right to be surprised by it, since I kept my own arithmetic in pencil and paid it faithfully. The snare took a child's foot instead of a coyote's. Farrell knew it. He'd found the wire pulled out of the ground and the blood on it and a small print in the mud, and he had gone to town and said Apache instead of saying I have hurt a child. 1 word instead of 5. It cost him nothing, and it bought him the whole valley's sympathy, and it turned a starving boy limping east into a raid, and it turned 11 frightened men into a posse, and it turned Cal Pike into a killer of 9-year-olds in a rust-colored blanket. That is what 1 word can buy. I've never gotten over the cheapness of it. He's a thief, Farrell said. He's a thief, and there's paper on him, and I'll have my 20 out of somebody. And behind me, the door opened. Roan Teague came out onto his own porch in his nightshirt and bare feet, in the cold, without a gun, and stood beside me. I'd seen 90 men come off that road in my life, and I had never once seen a clearing go as quiet as that clearing went. Farrell, he said, pleasant, almost kind, how's the shoulder? Farrell's mouth opened and shut. You want your $20. I want, Farrell's voice cracked and he had to start again. There's paper on him. Store's window. $20 delivered to the agency at San Carlos, and the agency pays it out and everybody's square. Delivered, Roan said. That's what it says. It doesn't say alive. Farrell didn't answer that. Nobody did. The paper didn't say alive. Papers never do, and the men who print them know exactly what they are not saying, and so does everybody who reads them, and that is the entire mechanism. Roan Teague reached into the pocket of his trousers. He did it slowly because 11 men had guns, and he was a man who understood precisely how the world worked. He brought out a soft leather poke worn white at the seams, and he loosened the string with his 2 crooked fingers, and he counted coin into his palm. I heard every one of them, gold and silver and the little flat clink they make. Then he came down his own steps, barefoot on the frost, and he stood in front of Farrell and held out his hand. 20, he said, you'll want to count it. Nobody breathed. Take it, Roan said. That's what he's worth. You put the number up yourself. You had a paper printed. Take your $20, Farrell, and go home and tell your wife what you sold. Farrell stared at that hand like it was full of live coals. I ain't, he said, that ain't. It's exactly what it is. It's a bounty, Teague, it ain't a. It's a price. Roan's voice never rose. It never once rose that whole night, and I have come to understand that this was the most frightening thing about him. You said it, I'm meeting it, that's commerce. That's the thing you all understand, so we're doing that. He stepped closer. Take it. And I watched a 51-year-old man begin to cry in front of 8 of his neighbors, and not know he was doing it. I never meant the wire for a kid, Farrell said. No, Roan agreed, you never do. He didn't take the money. Farrell turned and walked into the dark past the horses and stood with his back to all of us and his shoulders working, and I never in my life spoke to him again, and he sent a hindquarter of beef to my house every fall until he died, and never once put his name on it. Holly's Pike said, Horse, Teague, is there an Apache boy in that cabin? Roan turned around. He looked up at his own doorway where I stood, and I understood that I was being asked something. I could have said nothing. That is what I want you to hold on to. Silence was still on the table. Silence had got me this far in life. Silence had let the posse ride past my gate, and there has never been a moment in my 48 years when I have understood so exactly what a thing costs and gone ahead and bought it anyway. There is a child up there, I said, with his foot rotting off because Farrell wanted a coyote. I came down 1 step. He's 12. His hair's cut short like a schoolboy's, which some of you will know what that means, and I don't, and I mean to find out. He walked here on that foot. He hasn't cried where anybody could hear him. Another step. And my son is on that table because a frightened boy with a rifle saw a blanket in the dark. And if any one of you wants to tell me tonight about thieves, you can do it with the barrel in your teeth. Nobody wanted to tell me about thieves. Holly's Pike stood in the cold with his hat in his hands. He was a bad sheriff and a worse man, and I have prayed for him every night of my life since. "Cal," he said without turning, "come up here." "Pa, come up here." The boy came. 17. Hat off because his father's was off. He wouldn't look at me. He looked at the ground in front of my boots, and his whole face was swollen shut with crying, and he was, I realized with a kind of horror, about the same size as the child in the loft. "Tell her," Holly said. "Mrs. Wilcox." "Not that." Holly's voice broke clean in half. "Tell her what you told me on the road up. Tell her what you saw 2 days ago at Farrell's Water and never said." Cal Pike lifted his head. "I saw him," he said. "The whole clearing came in half an inch. 2 days back, down in the wash. He was." The boy stopped and swallowed and went on, "And I have never been prouder of anybody in my life, and I have never hated anybody more, both at once, which is a thing I did not know a person could do. He was on his hands and knees drinking out of the seep, and his foot was, you could see it wasn't right, he couldn't put it down, and he saw me, and he just stopped. He didn't run. He was too tired to run, and he just knelt there in the mud and looked at me, and waited to see what I'd do." "And what did you do?" I said. "I went home," Cal said, "and I told them I never seen anything." He wiped his face with the back of his wrist like a child. "And then 2 nights later I seen a shape in a blanket in your yard, and I shot it before I could think, because I'd been thinking about him for 2 days and I couldn't sleep, and I wanted him to not be real anymore. I wanted it to be over." He looked straight at me then, and his eyes were his father's, and he said the truest sentence anyone said on that mountain. "I didn't shoot Micah because I thought he was an Indian, Mrs. Wilcox. I shot him because I wanted to stop being afraid." They went down the hill. That's all. That's the whole ending of the posse of Kettle Springs. No shot fired. No speech. Nothing to put in a book. 11 men turned their horses in a barefoot man's yard and rode back down a road they'd come up meaning to be paid, and every one of them knew what they'd been and would spend the rest of their lives arranging it into a story where they hadn't been it. Ambrose stayed. He came up the steps last and stood in front of me with his bag and said, "Let me look at him." And I said, "No." And he said, "Ada, please." And I said, "No, Ambrose." And he sat down on the top step of Roan Teague's porch in the frost and put his face in his hands. He was still there at dawn. I stepped over him going in and out. I've thought about whether that was cruelty. I've decided it was, and that I'd do it again, and that both of those are true and don't cancel. The fever came up in Micah on the second day like weather. I don't remember the second day. I have Roan's word for what happened in it, which is, I did not sleep, I did not eat, I changed cloths, and at some point around 4 in the afternoon I stood up in the middle of the room and told my dead husband a number of things about the horse. The third day was the bad one. He went so hot that the sweat quit. That's the thing nobody tells you. You pray for the sweat, and then it stops, and you understand you'd been praying for the wrong thing. Roan had him stripped to the waist on wet sheeting with the door open and the mountain cold pouring in and the stove roaring behind us, both at once. The man's whole cabin turned into a set of lungs. And it wasn't enough. Around 3 in the morning, Micah's breathing changed to the thing I had heard once before, in February of '87, in my own bed. I said no. Roan had his hand flat on my son's chest and his head down and his eyes shut, listening, and he didn't move. "Do something. Ada. You did something for a bullet hole. You did something in the dark with 2 fingers broke. You do something now." "There's nothing left to do." He looked up. His face had come apart. That's the only way I know to say it. The weather face was gone and there was a man in there, ruined, 49 years old, and he said, "There's nothing left. It's him now. It's only him." And I did the thing I am least proud of. I turned around and I screamed up at that loft, at a child who had been lying in the dark for 3 days with a septic foot, listening to a white woman's son not die. I screamed up at him. "This is yours." Roan came up off the floor. He caught my arms. "He came off the mountain," I was saying. "He came here and they went hunting and my boy went out to check a bucket and it wasn't sense. None of it was sense, and I knew it wasn't sense while it was coming out of me, and it came out of me anyway. That's the part I need you to have. Not that I thought it. Anybody would think it. That I said it at the top of my voice to a starving child in the middle of the night." Roan held on to me. He didn't tell me I was wrong. He didn't say a word. He held on to my arms until the noise ran out of me, and then he put me in the chair, and then he went and stood at the bottom of the ladder with his back to me for a long time. The lamp guttered. And then without a sound, a boy came down. He came down backward, one rung at a time, holding all his weight on his arms and one leg, and the bad foot hung there wrapped in a mess of Roan's shirting, and it did not touch a single rung. He was small. That's what I hadn't been ready for. 12 and small, and his hair was cut off square at the ears in the way that no Chiricahua does and no Chiricahua ever would, and I found out later what the schools do with the hair, and I have never gotten it out of me. He stood at the foot of the ladder, holding the upright with one hand, and looked at me. I have been looked at by juries and by preachers and by my own mother. Nothing has ever been like being looked at by that boy in that cabin at 3 in the morning after what I had just screamed at him. He didn't hate me. That's what undid me. It would have been so much easier if he'd hated me. He looked at me the way you look at a storm that has already passed over the house, as weather, as something that had happened, as something that was not in the end about him. Then he hopped one hop to the table and put both hands on the edge and looked at my son. He said something, 2 words, to Roan, not to me. Roan said, "He's asking is that the one that got shot instead of him." I couldn't make a sound. Roan said quietly, "Yes." And that boy stood there on one foot and put his hand, small, filthy, the nails black, a burned scar across the back of it, flat on the middle of Micah's chest, right where Roan's had been. He didn't press. He just laid it there and left it, and he shut his eyes. And he began to sing. I want to describe it, and I can't. I've had 11 years. It wasn't loud. It was under the breath, almost humming, a thing with maybe 4 notes in it that turned around itself and came back, and it went on and on and on, and it was the single most exhausted sound I have ever heard a human being make. He was swaying. He'd been standing on one foot for 10 minutes, and he was swaying. And Roan brought a stool and put it under him, and he sat and never stopped singing, and never took his hand off my son's chest. I don't believe it did anything. I want to be honest with you all the way to the bottom of this, because I've earned the right and I've paid for it. I do not believe that song broke my son's fever. I believe medicine and cold air and the toughness of a 9-year-old body broke my son's fever, and I believe the ball went through him in the one path in 10,000 where it could have gone through. I believe that. And I have never in my life heard anything holier than a starving Apache boy on a stool, singing for the son of the town that had put a price on his head, in a language he had been beaten for speaking. Micah's breathing changed at dawn. The sweat came. The boy took his hand back and looked at it and rubbed it on his knee. Then he got up on his one foot and went and stood at the open door and looked out at the light coming over the dragoons, and Roan brought him a cup of broth, and he drank it in 3 swallows like a man in a hurry. He stayed 19 days. The foot took most of them. Roan opened it twice. The second time was worse than anything he'd done to Micah, and the boy lay on the table with a folded rag in his teeth and put his hand out, and I gave him mine, and he broke 2 of my fingers, and neither of us mentioned it, then or ever. Micah slept for 4 days and woke up hungry and mean about it. He was 9. Within a week he'd figured out that there was a bigger boy in the loft who couldn't chase him, and within 2 weeks they'd built an entire economy out of jacks and dried apple, and a wooden horse Roan whittled with a bone-handled knife, and neither of them spoke a word of the other's language. They didn't need it. I sat in the corner of that cabin like a piece of furniture and watched my son teach a Chiricahua boy the rules of a game he was making up as he went, entirely by outrage, entirely by hand gestures, entirely by shouting no, no, no like this. And I watched that boy, who had walked 80 miles on a snared foot, who had knelt in the mud and waited to see what a white boy with a rifle would do, laugh out loud so hard he had to hold his ribs. I went outside and stood in the trees for a while that day. Roan let me be. He was good at that. It was, I came to understand, most of what he was for. I asked him about the box once near the end. The shoe, the comb, the tin ring, the blue calico. We were splitting wood, he split, I stacked. I'd have gone mad otherwise, and he set them all down on the block and looked at his hands for a while. 91, he said. No, 81. He stopped and did the sum honestly. 8 years ago. There was a woman and a girl walking out of the Gila country after Sibicu. The girl was about 6. There was a price. How much? $10. 20, that's more than last time. I had it, Roan said. That's the part. I want you to understand I had the $10 in my pocket. I rode out to buy them off a man named Sims. He picked them all back up and turned it over, looking at the head. I was 3 hours behind. He set another round on the block. He'd only got the 10 for the 2 of them together, he said. 10 for the 2. So there wasn't any reason for him to be careful with them, you see. The math didn't require it. He split the round. It went in one stroke. I got there in the evening and I asked him their names, Roan said, and he laughed at me. He laughed at me, Ada. He was not a cruel man. He was a bookkeeper. He genuinely did not understand what I was asking him any more than you'd understand a man asking what your fence posts were called. He tossed the halves toward me. I buried them and I didn't have anything to put on it. He stopped. He was breathing carefully. That's what's in the box. That's what's in the box, Ada. There's a shoe in there because I don't have a name. I said, so you ask first. I ask first. Even with a gun on you. Especially with a gun on me, Roan Teague said, and swung and split the next round, and that was the last time either of us ever spoke about it. On the 20th morning he was gone. The loft was made up. The wooden horse was on Micah's pillow. The bandage was folded on the table in a square, and Roan's bone-handled knife was gone off the shelf, and so was the moth-eaten wool coat that had been hanging by the door since before I ever came up that hill, and I have always believed Roan left both out where they could be taken, and never said so. Micah wept until he was sick. 9 years old, standing in the doorway of that cabin in his nightshirt, screaming a name up at the mountain. Because he had a name to scream. I didn't know it. That was the thing. I stood behind my own son with my hands useless at my sides and listened to him call 3 syllables up into the pines over and over, and I did not know what they meant or how they were spelled or what to write in my ledger, and I said, Micah, Micah, what is it? What's his name? And my son turned around with his face streaming and looked at me, 9 years old, and he looked at me exactly the way that boy had looked at me from the foot of the ladder, and he said, he gave it to me. And he never told me, not at 10, not at 15 when he got mean about it, not at 19 when he enlisted, which I fought him on for a year and lost, not in the letter he sent me from the Philippines in 1900, which is 4 pages long and mentions a great many things. He gave it to Micah, and Micah kept it. I have made my peace with this the way you make peace with a stone in a field, by plowing around it every year for the rest of your life. Roan Teague died on the 9th of March, 1900, alone, of nothing in particular, which is what happens to men who are never sick until they are. Holly's Pike found him. There's an irony in that I have never been able to get to the bottom of. He'd left the cabin to me. There was a paper about it, done properly, witnessed in town 2 years before by a lawyer nobody knew he'd ever spoken to, and it named me Ada Wilcox and not the name I'd taken by then. And I sat in that lawyer's office and looked at my own maiden name in Roan's small square hand and had to be given water. I went up the mountain in April when the road opened. I'd like to tell you the box was on the shelf. It wasn't. I looked in every place a man can put a thing in 2 rooms and it was not there, and it has never been found, and I have decided, this took me some years, that he burned it, and that he did it on a day when he had finally understood that a list of the dead is a thing a man keeps for himself. Or he gave it to somebody. I allow for that. I keep allowing for it. What was on the table, squared up in the middle of the bare boards where he'd laid my son down, was a stub of pencil and a schoolbook copybook, unused, 40 pages, and a slip of paper on top that said, "Ada, you keep a ledger." That's all, 4 words and a dash, from a man who once talked to a 9-year-old for 2 hours straight so the boy wouldn't be alone in the dark. I am writing this in that cabin. I come up in the summers now. The dog's grandson is under the table with his chin on my foot, and he is exactly as useless as his grandfather was. The copybook is beside me, and it is not unused anymore. It has 140 names in it. Some I got from the agency at San Carlos, where a clerk let me read the rolls for 2 days and then discovered he'd be in trouble for it. Some I got from a woman at Fort Sill who had been 6 years old on a train to Florida and remembered more than any of us deserved. Some are only a place and a word. Boy, woman, old. Some are scratched out and written again, because I learned them wrong the first time and went back years later to fix it. There's a paper still nailed inside the mercantile window in Kettle Springs. Not the same paper. They've had a new one printed. It's for a man now, not a boy, and the number is larger, and I've stood in front of it in the road with my basket on my arm and watched perfectly kind people walk past it the way you'd walk past a notice about a lost dog. I went in last month to settle my account and Farrell's grandson was behind the counter and he said, "Morning, Mrs. Vance." And I said good morning, and I paid what I owed, and I looked at the paper on my way out and I read the number. Then I came up the mountain, and I opened this book. Because somewhere out there, if he's alive, is a man of 23 with a foot that never healed right and a name my son knows and I don't. And I have never once been able to write him down. Not one line. Not a place. Not a word, nothing, because I never earned it and Roan told me I'd have to, and I never did. So I keep the ledger, and I leave the first page empty. And every summer I come up here and I sit at this table and I look at that empty page. And sometimes late, when the wind gets in the pines and the light goes, I catch myself doing a thing I'd be ashamed to admit to anybody living. I say it out loud into the room the way he taught me. Before anything, before are you hurt and who sent you and what do you want? I say, what's your name? And I wait. I always wait a while.